When people break bread together, something spiritual happens. And so I sort of translated that from my days in communion. And communion isn't just something you do at an altar. But when you sit down and break bread with your enemies, there is something spiritual that goes on that we as Christians would say, the Lord is present in your midst. Buddhists might say something else. Muslims might say something else, but everybody will realize that in the breaking of bread, in the sharing of food, there is something spiritual that can happen even between enemies. And so whenever I had negotiations at the UN, I don't care who they were with or what it was about, we always started with a meal. And by starting with a meal, I never missed. We never left the table with things unresolved. But it was an appreciation of diversity, an acceptance of diversity, and a realization that the person with whom you disagree with most is also God's child, or there's something of an inner spiritual transcendence within them. Now, the hardest place to deal with that, and somebody reminded me, I said this all the time, it was easy for me to prepare to deal with my enemies. But the biggest problem of diversity in your life and in mine was first my brother. I mean, my younger blood brother. Loving him was difficult. Next was my mother. Because I didn't have any sisters. So I get along better with women than I do with men. But my mother was, I was 50 years old, still her baby. And mamas are always mamas. I don't care who you are, but you're always going to have a diversity clash with your mother. And my father never forgave me for not being a baseball player and a dentist. I was sworn in as ambassador to the United Nations, and Thurgood Marshall swore me in at the White House and said to my father, "You must be proud of this boy." And his answer was, if he'd have been a dentist, he'd have been somebody. So the differences between gender. I never got mad with the Ku Klux Klan. I never lost my temper in a UN battle. I wish I could say that about two of the sweetest women I've ever known, the women I've been married to. They can push a button whenever they're ready, that can send me right straight through the ceiling. The only other person who could do that is my son. And I realized that these are the people I love the most. But we are different. When you marry a strong, independent woman, just as well accept it. If there's a man's point of view, there is a woman's point of view. And God wouldn't have made men and women different if he didn't want two points of view. And if there's anything of any importance and you don't get two opinions, you know what that makes you. So you just as well learn to listen. You just as well learn to try to understand the other side. And if you don't learn to understand a woman's point of view, you will never be happy. They will give you hell all of your life. You cannot get away from them. You're attracted to them. But if you don't learn to listen and love and understand, that diversity will send you to your grave with a nervous breakdown and an empty pocket divorce. So you just as well learn that the male-female difference is a God-given diversity that we better learn to deal with, and we better learn to respect. And that includes respecting a woman who might be the President of the United States. You're supposed to clap. No, I'm kidding. But it does. It means that you have to understand the diversity of gifts that are not confined to any one sex nor to any one gender. I used to always read to my parents a little book that they gave to me, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. Your children are not your children. They come through you, but not from you. You can give them your love, but not your thoughts. You can learn from them, but don't try to make, you can try to be like them, but don't try to make them like you, because history moves forward and not backward. Well, that was wonderful when I was reading it to my parents. But when I started trying to influence my children, and much less my grandchildren, good God Almighty. I mean, there's absolutely no understanding, no communication, and everything you want of them, they disagree with. Why? Because they're just like you. I was about to spank my little 2-year-old girl one time, and this 65-year-old woman, who at that time I thought was old, grabbed me by the arm and said, "Andy, now just remember, that's nothing but your blood acting up in her." It puts it in perspective. And so loving your children when they're different, but you're loving your children not when they're different. You're loving them. The hardest time to love them is when they are like you and they're making the same mistakes you made, or when they're about to do some things that you know better and it costs you all manners of difficulty, and you see them doing the same thing over and over again. Loving them when it's unlovable is the real test of diversity. But it's easier to do that with the Russians. It's easier to do that with the Chinese. It's almost easier to understand terrorists than it is to understand your 2.5-year-old grandchild in a temper tantrum. But that's when diversity is significant. And when you realize that there is no way of getting around it. God had to have a sense of humor. He made us all just enough alike so that we could reach and understand each other, but then he made all of us just enough different so that we'd all get on each other's nerves. And yet we can't do anything without each other. And the test of our success quite often is how we deal with difference.